Hey, everybody. Welcome to DCARI's 14th virtual fire investigative program. We have Dave Phelan. He's back. He did session 13 with us as well, but now he's doing session 14 with us. So Dave has 25 years in the fire service. He's a private fire investigator now. He is in New Jersey, and he's also part of the New Jersey IAAI. And we welcome Dave back. And today we're going to do photography as part of the fire scene documentation process. So Dave, go ahead and take it over.
All right, great. Thank you once again. This is the second module. Hopefully, if you haven't taken the other one, hopefully you go and take number 13 as well and get something out of that. This is a Dropbox link that I maintain. It has all my handout materials, support materials, and different forms and such. There's also a PDF of the slides that you're about to see, so you can download that as well. And I know Bill's going to make that available as part of the online process. So you'll be able to get that, and feel free to pass around and share it. This is the free gift for your time and attention today, hopefully to get a good positive review. I made a worksheet, job aid for documenting electrical panels. And it's there in the Dropbox for your taking and your use. Feel free to pass it around to everyone. It's my way of essentially encouraging good or better documentation. So we're going to talk about the photography component of fire scene documentation, because the truth is, taking pictures alone does not create a complete fire scene documentation process. Photography is very important, but it is not the sole element of it. And it's important to keep that in mind, especially sometimes if it seems like a small fire and maybe we're working alone, run in, grab a few pictures and, kind of get on our way. There's different parts that have to be addressed beyond that. So 921 kind of reminds us of this. And they say that the documentation includes measurements, diagrams, and or photographs with the intent of creating a future as-built or reconstruction of the fire scene. That's really why we're focusing so hard on not just getting a picture of the supposed point of origin, but the actual scene around us, the enclosing space, the building, the open yard, whatever it may be. Because we're going to have to go back some point in the future and not just tell the story of what happened, but be able to actually demonstrate to people this is what happened. All right. And so in order to do that, you kind of have to have a mindset about the documentation process. And if you're working alone, you've got a lot to keep in mind. I totally get that. And so it's easy sometimes to get ourselves a little sidetracked. And if you're working in a team or a group, whether it's 2 or 200, the people who are charged with the documentation element, whether they are sketching, photographing, or any other element of that, it's all about the mindset and the job that you're doing. And there's a couple of key points to be made. And the first is, the earlier you are in any investigation, as far as the time from notification to arrival to when you start your work, the earlier it is, the more crucial every little single thing is. We don't have any idea what's going to matter, so therefore everything has to matter. And then maybe down the road, we'll be able to start narrowing our focus at certain things. But the sooner and the earlier it is in the process, in fact, the more relevant everything is, because those small pieces of data, that information can easily get, brushed aside or overlooked because there seems to be something bigger happening at the moment. And then therefore, when you find what you think is significant data, whether it's an observation, a device or a piece of evidence, or just the context of the fire scene itself in a pattern, in a wall, in a shot of the building, whatever it is. When you think you have something that is more significant than other things, that's where you spend your more time and effort in documentation of it. Okay, you have to kind of play priorities with the handicap of everything being important, and somehow you have to also figure out what becomes more important. Nobody said it was going to be easy. And the same goes to witnesses and witness statements. The more significant you think a witness or a witness statement is, the more effort you have to put forth in corroborating and possibly refuting it by independent data. Because ultimately, that's the only way we're going to know. We're going to have to test the authenticity and the weight that we provide to something. The good news is, in today's world, there's generally a lot of available data, sometimes too much that it can be overwhelming, and working with limited resources, sometimes we discard it because we don't think it's going to be relevant. And that may or may not be a valid assumption by the time it's over. All right. So I went back in the case histories and all the interesting cases, and I just pulled these 3 photos because these are all fire investigations, and yet clearly there's not even a trace of soot or smoke, flame or heat in any of these photos. Yet at the same time, every one of them contains relevant data about the underlying fire. And so whether it's a building under construction and clear signs of, people using it to either congregate, smoke, hide from authorities, whatever it may be, a vehicle fire with a variety of pharmaceuticals. And there's a whole backstory that I'm not going to get into, but hiding a weapon in a box of flooring, in an empty flooring box, there's a story there. And so it's part of documenting your fire scene. And this is kind of I'll say it's a shortcut to supervising your people. If part of your job is to supervise people and, they conduct investigations and they come back to the office and you review the case file, take a look at the photos. And if every photograph in the case file is burned, sooted, melted, flaming, or otherwise damaged, maybe there's something we missed. Because the truth is, the fire scene is not limited to just that which burned or melted in the origin, near the origin, or perhaps remote from the origin, but the fire impacting a victim. So keep that in mind when you're trying to evaluate how thorough the whole process was. Chances are good that in any fire scene, there's going to be a fair body of work, either in photo or video, that is not directly burned. And in some cases, that's just as relevant as the thing that is burned that we suppose in the area of origin. It's a good example. This was a public sector fire responded to. Fire occurred in a private house. Storm swept through the area, 3 days without power, and we get sent to a structure fire. And the circumstances, kind of all come at you in different bits and pieces, but what was pretty evident is that the fire occurred in close proximity, time-wise, to the return of utility power. People in the neighborhood have been without power for 3 days, power returns, and within a very short period of time, minutes to maybe 10 minutes, the neighbors are all reporting fire trucks and emergency vehicles screaming into the neighborhood. And it isn't until a little bit later on that interviewing the police officer, and the police officer says, I got here, people on the front lawn said everyone was out. I ran around the back just to make sure there was nobody injured in the backyard, kind of get a feel for the fire. And he says, I didn't think anything of it. He says, the homeowner is on the back deck of the house, and he looked like he was tucking something under the tarp that was over the generator. And he was not at all impressed or apparently confused or distracted by the fact that there was fire blowing out 2 windows of the house. And he says that, whatever, people do strange things. Well, it wasn't until that little story was told that we went and looked under the tarp in the back deck, and there's the generator, and there's the plug and the wire. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that this house was being backfed improperly by a double-ended extension cord. And, is that a crime? Thankfully, nobody got hurt. But the point is, the best piece of documentation turned out to not have anything near it that was burned or melted, but it told a great deal of the story. And when questioned about it, the homeowner said, yeah, I work at a commercial building, and I was complaining to my coworkers that I didn't have power and this and that. And he said, so my coworker, who's kind of a mechanical guy, he gave me this and he told me to plug it into the generator and plug it into the receptacle on the back deck of my house. And in his words, it would light up my whole house. And sure enough, it did. Same kind of thing, this is a set vehicle fire in a recreational vehicle, and going through the fire scene debris. Okay, there's a piece of burned and crumpled paper, but what was interesting about the paper is that it was underneath the pile of briquettes, which were on the back seat. And yeah, people buy a bag of briquettes, they maybe put it on the back seat of the vehicle to, drive to wherever they're going. And so that doesn't seem all that unusual, except that when you interview the people in the vehicle, every seat was full. So if every seat's full, who's sitting on the bag of charcoal? Well, nobody was. But yet there's this bag of, or the remains of a bag of charcoal, a pile of briquettes in the back seat. And when you dig through the briquettes to get to the bottom layers, you come to the protected area against the upholstery of the seat and this little remnant of paper that presumably was the container or the wrapping of the briquette. Photograph it, yep, document it, dry it, brush it clean. Suddenly, we start to get information. And one photo leads to the second photo, and we're starting to tell the story, because it's not always just about showing the door was open, the door was closed. This is part of a continuing story here. And now that we've cleaned the paper and brushed it, laid it flat, we start to detail certain elements of it. And a little bit of sleuthing, a little bit of always good luck. And suddenly we've got a product that matches the package. The product matches a location. The location matches a transaction. The transaction matches a video camera. And you build the story. And more so when you have to tell this story, we're not just saying to someone, we found a piece of paper in the debris. The piece of paper belonged to a charcoal bag. You can walk them through this. So good photographs as part of your documentation are not always just for making the report. They're also for telling that story and filling in the pieces that when you have to testify, you're narrating what can be demonstrated visually to somebody on the screen. So the photographs truly are a key part of the overall process, but they do not replace the other parts of the process. Photography and photographic documentation, it's a skill, clearly. And the only way you get better at it is through continuous experience and experimentation. It's not just about always taking a lot of pictures, but it's about learning what good picture taking entails. And that's both a technique of photography as well as the utilization and the mastery of the equipment you're working with. It really is a true tool of the profession. And so you need to take the time to truly learn about it. If you want to test the theory, ask a law enforcement investigator the make, model, and magazine capacity of their service weapon. Then ask the non-law enforcement investigator the make, model, and size or megapixel capacity of their camera. And you quickly start to realize, yeah, this is a very often used piece of equipment in our toolbox, and we don't often understand a lot about how it works. And that learning and that gap can sometimes show in the end result. And we want to try to button that up and close that learning gap and build experience, but also with knowledge and understanding of the technique. 921 has this really nice little statement they make. Photographs may be the most persuasive factor in accepting an investigator's theory of the fire evolution. True, that's it. It's not just about proving the origin and the cause, but it's the entire evolution, including the circumstances that brought those factors together. So again, telling the story and having photographs that back it up along the way. Some other good passages in 921. If you haven't taken a lot of time yet to look at the 2021 edition of 921, they've made a fair amount of changes. I'm sure some people have some opinions about all those changes, but with regard to the documentation and photography section, very little has changed, and it is not technical in nature. It's more substantive to just add clarity. So if you learned what it was under 2017, nothing really has changed of substance in this regard anyway. We made the big changes elsewhere. Photographs are absolutely time sensitive. The sooner the better. And you know, if the circumstance allows, or you have the investigator on duty to start responding and arriving with the initial companies, there's a value to that. You know, I'm not suggesting that we break protocol and just start freelancing, but it is absolutely critical that we get the investigative component and the documentation going as quickly as possible. And so from the moment you arrive, you have your PPE, you take care of the administrative part of, you know, checking in and accountability. But an investigator walking around the scene without a notepad, pencil, and even a low-end camera is really not doing a good job of capturing the moment, because so much of what happens at the moment of arrival through the extinguishment component, so much of that documentation can become absolutely essential to proving and often disproving counter theories of our investigation. I mean, you know, let's just take for a moment the scenario of a victim being removed from a building and ultimately perishing. There's going to be plenty of reporting from emergency medical to hospital and ultimately to medical examiner on that person's injuries and what led to their cause of death. But if there could also be the photographs that show the fire conditions surrounding the rescue, that is part of that convincing story to document what happened. So that if it is a criminal event and we have to go to a trial and show the photographs, yeah, we can show the autopsy, we can show those things, but let me take you back to the fire scene. These are the fire conditions in the rooms below where that person was rescued. And this is why they couldn't get out. And this is why their injuries were this, even though they were found in an area that perhaps was remote from the origin. It's an exceptionally valuable thing. It just, you know, over the course of time in the public sector, I didn't appreciate the photo buffs or the, sometimes they call them the Sparkies that follow the fire trucks and take pictures and such. I didn't really appreciate for so many years. It wasn't until the very end, and certainly now in private sector investigation, how much information can be obtained from amateur or bystander photos and videos, things that you wouldn't normally have ever had about your fire scene. So it's an incredibly important element. So let's talk about taking the picture, because for the most part, that's where, you know, that's where the attention is going to show. When we walk into a fire scene, we have to understand the conditions we're working in. And in many cases, those conditions are contrary to how the camera is meant to work. And so we are immediately working at a deficit over the equipment's capability. Fire scenes are generally not well illuminated by natural sources. A lot of, you know, it could be a bright, sunny, clear day outside. And of course, your fire is going to be in the basement and there's going to be no natural openings. So we have to now compensate for that by bringing in lighting and bringing in enough to help us, but not too much to harm us. And it has to work with the camera based on what the camera's capabilities are. And so we have to quickly understand that. That can be one of the hardest things to overcome, because you may have to move your lighting with you room to room so that you can see what you're doing, as well as also capturing images to reflect the conditions. The good news is, at that point of the fire investigation, it's essentially a motionless, inanimate fire scene. It's not going anywhere. So while it's a deficiency, we also hold an advantage card. And the advantage is time. We can now set up to overcome the deficiencies of our fire scene and get good quality photos. You know, if you compare the front cover photo on Sports Illustrated of the midair football catch and what it takes to get that photo to be in crisp, absolutely sharp detail, no motion blur, but everyone knows that this is an absolute split second of time. You know, the skill that that photographer needs to do that, to be a sports photographer, is very much different than a fire scene, but we are working with a known type of photographic environment. So we have to play to that strength, and we have to therefore train to those conditions. And ultimately, we should be buying equipment that is optimized for those conditions. You know, could the sports photographer on the sideline at the Super Bowl take a good fire scene photo in a room with no openings? Maybe, but their equipment is not designed or set to work within that capability. And so we have to work in the same approach. We know the conditions we're going to work in. We need to select equipment that is optimized for it and also learn to use it in that capacity. Because the truth is we do have a limited amount of time. The fire scene may be inanimate, but eventually we have to move on. And so if we didn't get it, we miss it and we lose it forever. And that's the problem. That's the real big thing that we have to take away, is that we more or less get one shot to do it, even though we may have time and multiple pictures to try to do it. Okay. This is a series of photos that came out of a test burn at one of the basic fire investigation classes we did. You know, we're in the burn cell. They're roughly, I think, 10-foot square. And you've probably all been to at least one of these where a fire is staged. A Confederate poses as a participant for an interview, and a group of investigators or trainees is, you know, tasked to handle this. And so when I show you this picture, and the longer you look at it, you start to put together some things real fast. But we're looking at a piece of upholstered furniture. And what's unique about this is that this piece of upholstered furniture was in the burn room, and it had no less than 4 investigators poring over it, looking, you know, examining, piecing together, dealing with all the information available. And at the end of their work, they decided, you know what, let's get the big objects out of the room. Let's examine the floor, everything else. And then later we can reposition large objects, a very valid approach to an investigation. They did not see what you're seeing right now, even though it was right there in front of them. It wasn't until the couch was carried outside, set on the ground in the broad daylight, that one of the other team members, who happened to be the law enforcement officer playing the interview or performing the interview role, finished the interview and started looking around at the couch, you know, just trying to piece it all together, and suddenly realizes that in broad daylight, that piece of blue plastic is unmistakable and screams out for attention. That one person saw with adequate natural lighting what 4 other investigators didn't and couldn't see, simply because they were working in that dark and dimly lit area that we know as a fire scene. And so very quickly, the dynamic of their investigation changed. But what it really comes down to is the fact that lighting, visible light, helps you and helps the camera see what's already there. That's the bottom line. In fact, that's a slide coming up if they ever question you on the stand about adding artificial light to a fire scene. Visible light helps people and helps the cameras see what's already there. And this little exchange, you know, on this one particular training fire made that point, and that so many people had been looking at it and just couldn't see for what it was, not because they didn't know. They were all investigators. They all would have recognized the spring, you know, the spring valve, and the in the bottom right there is the flame shield off the lighter. And then of course, if you roll it away from the burn debris, you know, it's clearly identifiable. It was all there all along. It was lighting that was preventing them from seeing it. And the same thing works when you're talking about a camera. If you haven't already looked at the prior presentation, we go into great detail about camera settings for RAW or DNG, digital negative file format compared to JPEG. And if your camera is capable of doing it or shooting simultaneous RAW and JPEG, there is a lot of reason to seriously consider that type of change in your investigative protocols or agency protocols. Building on that though, if you control the camera settings and if you learn to control them, you get to tell the camera what you want to see versus the camera deciding this is what you're going to get. When you press the little shutter button halfway down and we get that little confirmation beep, and sometimes you hear the focus motor, you know, coming into focus, and then you press it the second half or the full press and you capture the image. If you're using the camera in its automatic mode, the camera is deciding what you're going to get based on how the camera has been essentially programmed, how it was made and told to take pictures. And for the most part, it works. The big problem is when camera manufacturers make a camera and build the hardware and the processing software into the camera, they give it a variety of operating environments. And no one yet has made a camera specifically programmed and told how to work in a fire scene, how to work in dimly lit environments which are surrounded by light absorbing non-reflective surfaces, burned sooty things. And so we're taking the camera out of any possible operating range that it was ever told that it would have to consider, and we're still expecting it to give us good pictures. By and large, it does, but we've probably all been there at least once or twice where we're trying to take a picture and the camera will not adjust, focus, or anything else. And we press the button halfway and we can never get it to take a picture because the camera is not able to process the fire scene. And so we try different things to maybe fool it or trick it. But the bottom line is the camera is outside of its element. And we would be doing a better job if we manually took control of the camera and said, here's what you're going to do, because I know that's what I want. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit, but that gets far into more advanced photographic techniques. Just a moment or word of caution here, because most digital devices now can also take video, and in some cases it can take very high quality video. Digital cameras and even some portable electronics are now capable of 4K at 60 frames per second, which, you know, is fantastic for quality and sharpness. It looks great. Every commercial advertising 4K 60 looks like epic material. However, if you're capturing in a format such as 4K 60, and the intended audience, such as the courtroom or the deposition room, or maybe it's just the training room in the firehouse, is not capable of 4K 60, you're going to have a problem trying to play that video. And in the least risk area, we would have to use a utility program which converts 4K 60 into maybe 720 or 1080, which could be played on practically any flat screen or most projectors. So from the training environment, it's not going to really make a big deal. But if we go into the courtroom, particularly in the criminal courtroom, and we have a video, and we suddenly find out that the projector or the screen in the courtroom is not capable of 4K or 4K at 60, and therefore it can't play, we've got a little bit of a problem. And even if the solution is, well, we'll run it through a converter, understand that when you run a format through a converter, it is discarding image data. It is deciding what data you don't need. And therefore, the image or the video that is produced in the conversion is not truly what was captured on the day of the video. And that opens the door to a lot of potential exclusion arguments. And so if you haven't, lesson 13 will get into a lot of detail there. So with that being said, what do I have to do to get a good image? Because I want to take good fire scene photos, and I want to be able to not only tell the story, but convincingly demonstrate my theory of the fire's evolution. And so basically, good photography, good image capture works in two parallel pathways. One is the actual image exposure. And image exposure is what the camera sees and how it sees it. Because the camera is nothing more than a viewport into the world. Just like our eyes are a viewport into the world, the camera is a viewport into the world. It sees things differently because of how it works than what we see with our eye. And the second part is known as photo composition, or sometimes framing of the subject. And that is, what do I want this picture to tell? What piece of the story do I want this image to tell? And making sure that I control the camera in such a way that that's what the camera records, versus letting the camera decide for me what I'm going to get to see later, because that might not always be the same objective. Image exposure is made up of 3 different camera settings: ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. Those 3 things together constitute essentially every digital photo that's taken. Back in the film days, many cameras, especially early cameras, you had to control those settings manually, and you didn't find out until you got your film developed if you got the image. Too bright, too dark, blurry, whatever it may have been. When we went to the digital technology and digital cameras introduced image processing software in the cameras started to make those decisions for us. And so we were able to very quickly and ultimately very inexpensively produce a camera that anyone could use, and all they had to know how to do was to point the camera in the direction of what they wanted and press a button or tap a floating button on the screen, and they would capture the image. And the camera essentially did everything else. And that is essentially what digital photography has become. You know, we've put inexpensive, very easy, almost simplistic devices in the hands of everyone out there, and they believe that they can take pictures, and they do. But we're not talking about, you know, our dog running and playing in the park. We're not talking about our kids at the beach. We're talking about very technical subject matter, and knowing how to control the camera is the key to overcoming the fact that the camera is inherently weak for this particular task. In a relative order of priority, lighting is the king feature, all right? If you can't get the natural lighting, you will have to compensate with artificial. Artificial lighting could be as fairly straightforward as the onboard or the built-in flash in your camera. If the flash in your camera can do what you need it to do, well, that was enough light. But if the area involved is large enough, or the onboard flash in the camera is too small, you will have to provide secondary artificial lighting. And whether it's remote flashing or simply fixed lighting like floodlights and handheld lights, things like that. But that is absolutely the key. If there's $1 in the budget to spend on equipment for the camera box, you're probably better off to spend it on lighting, because that's the one thing that has the most impact on the overall outcome of the image, okay? Once you've understood what the lighting conditions are and you've overcome them to the best of your capability, the rest becomes a function of adjusting the camera, okay? If I have only a limited amount of lighting and I have too wide of a scene to capture, I'm gonna have to tell the camera, hey, you're gonna have to do some stuff for me so that I can get the most out of the lighting, because it's not enough lighting, all right? And then once you've resolved that issue or adjusted the camera accordingly, now you can focus essentially on focusing the camera. pointing it in the right direction, framing it to get what you want, and then ultimately capturing the photo. Okay, but if you kind of take that process and turn it in reverse, where you aim the camera, focus it, and press the button, and then you look down at the little 2-inch LCD screen to go, did I get it? Most of the time in the fire scene, you're going to be stuck looking at very dark images. Okay, because by bringing the camera into the fire scene, we've brought it into a place that it was never really meant to work. And so we have to shore up the rest of that, that camera to function. The good news is, right, the fire scene isn't moving. All right, it's not like capturing the football mid-flight. We have the time that we need to change settings, move cameras, move lighting, and capture that image. And it may take 10, 15, or 20 different times to finally get the one that is going to make it work for you. But that is that, if there's any advantage to take away from it, it's that once you've gone past suppression and you have extinguishment, you start your investigation generally inside or on the interior, it's not moving. And it won't move for as long as we tell it not to move. That's the one good thing you can take out of it. Now you just have to make that advantage work for every other part of the problem. As we talk about these different settings, the ISO, the shutter, the aperture, and ultimately how it affects something called depth of field, it's exceptionally confusing. And probably most of you have never had to make these adjustments. So on the Dropbox is this cheat sheet. And what I've tried to do is take these settings and display them in a relational sense to each other. I don't know if it's going to work for you. It's what I made up when I was in photography class because I couldn't keep the numbers straight. And so I said, I need a cheat sheet that I can fold up and keep in the camera bag to keep myself thinking straight. And so here's the final and the finessed version of that, if it helps you. Hopefully it does. So one of the settings that you have to be somewhat cognizant of is white balancing. For the most part, every camera that is out there has an automatic white balance setting or option where the camera determines where the zero reference is for the color white in the image. That's fine. And again, generally it works. The problem comes when we have to add artificial lighting, particularly when we're adding, I'll say emergency floodlights and LED floodlights and things like that, light boxes and lanterns. The color represented as the temperature of the light that's being produced changes the tint of the light on the surface. So in other words, if I was to go into a fire scene with an old school Circle D floodlight, and I'm sure some people out there remember the old Circle Ds. They were, these wonderfully, warm and cozy lights that you could dry your gloves on at the fire scene. But they were very yellow and they had this very warm glow about them. And so when you would take a picture, particularly in the early days of early color film, it was common to get this yellowy cast to everything. It worked, but it wasn't that great. When they started introducing the ability to adjust white balance through camera settings, we were able to tell the camera, here's the condition of the light, whether it's warm, neutral, or a very cold, harsh, I'll say a modern LED looking cold light. This is what the zero reference for white is. Adjust all other colors from this. And so where we see this change on a fire scene quite often is when our initial fire scene photos and our exterior shots of, say, the house or the structure are taken in daylight. So we have this natural kind of naturally warm, yellowy sunlight. And then when we're done with those, we go inside the building and we bring with us our floodlights or our LED battery lights, and we set them up in the room and we're illuminating the wall and we're taking pictures. Those LED lights, those modern rescue type floodlights, they have a very cold temperature. And therefore they create this white, almost metallic-y blue cast or blue hue. if the camera is auto adjusting, it will compensate to some degree for that. If you're manually adjusting, you have to tell it, hey, we just went from one lighting condition to another. I have to change the reference for what white really is. And the easiest way to do this, if you're outside, is to focus the camera on a painted white but clean emergency vehicle, whether it's an ambulance or police car or something, and make sure that it is recording the white of that vehicle as true white compared to how you see it. And then when you go inside, same kind of thing. You're not going to probably find a clean white surface in a fire building. So white paper, a blank piece of white paper, to confirm that what the camera sees as white is being recorded as white. Here's two examples. This is essentially the same photograph. Nothing about the camera changed, except that I took the first picture using a color temperature of 2600, which is a warmth, you know, in the setting sun, and it gives you a realistic picture of what the surrounding area looks like, and the colors kind of have richness to them. If I take that same photo a moment later, but I manually tell the camera that we are operating at under artificial lighting that has a very cold bluish hue to it, well, suddenly it thinks white is blue, and that's the image you get. All right, and you may have already experienced this without understanding what it was. If you tried taking pictures indoors under fluorescent lighting. Fluorescent lighting can often confuse the light sensor on digital devices, and so you'll get images which are either seemingly very dark for being in a well-lit room, or it kind of has this bluish cast or bluish tint to it. And that's all the impact of the lighting in the space being interpreted by the camera. The next setting is known as ISO. And in the old school days, when we were using film cameras, people would often order their film by referring to this as the film speed, which is not exactly or is not at all related to the shutter speed, but it was known as film speed back in the day. The truth is, ISO is the setting which represents how sensitive the camera is to light. So when you have a very low ISO setting, like a 100, what you're telling the camera is that there is an abundance of light. It is so bright that you can essentially dial the sensor down. All right. And then as you move upwards through the ISO ranges, they are more suited for low light conditions, which is good because we often work in low light conditions and or at night. But there's a catch. There's always a give and take with technology. For the most part, you're gonna work with the camera either manually set or in its automatic range between 1 to 400, ISO 1 to 400. 100 is that daytime, middle of July, clear day, sunny car fire in an intersection. 400 is the indoor fire scene during the day where you've got a mix of natural light with either flash or artificial light. Once you push the camera into ISO 800, 1200, and digital cameras now, they have some incredible ISOs. I think my camera does an ISO of like 50,000. I don't really know why. But the problem is when you go beyond roughly ISO 800, you very quickly start to lose the sharpness of the image, because in making the sensor more sensitive to light, it becomes grainier pretty quickly. And therefore you may think, oh, well, I can get a dark nighttime shot in an open field of this, you know, whatever, a trailer or something like that, a wildland fire. However, when you take the picture and you look at it later on a computer or on a screen, you're gonna be like, wow, it's pretty grainy. Well, they refer to it as digital noise, but yeah, it's a grainy image. And so the bad news is it doesn't look nearly as good as that same picture would look under daylight. The not so great news is that it's grainy, but you still have an image. And so you have to consider that. Don't not take a picture just because you don't think it's going to come out well. Take a picture, take as many pictures as you need to attempt to capture your subject, even if they're not coming out perfectly, you're still capturing the image. And whether we can work with it and enhance it later is a separate issue. But you should never really have the excuse that I didn't take the picture because I didn't think it was going to come out good. Nope. Bad picture is still a picture. Okay. No picture will never be anything. Bad picture, you still have a little bit of a chance. Shutter speed is just that, the speed or the length of time in which the shutter remains open. And as long as the shutter is open, the image sensor in the camera is recording data. It is capturing light hitting the sensor. Right? It's measured in fractions of a second, potentially up to infinite, or what they call manual shutter. In other words, I push it, the shutter opens, and later I will release it and the shutter will close. Okay, there's a lot of different artistic reasons why that photographic technique is done. At a fire scene, there's an absolute need to consider a manual shutter. All right, and that has to do with overcoming darkness with time. So if the fire scene is dark and the image sensor works because of light that reaches it, I need to leave the shutter open long enough for as much light as possible to reach it. Now that sounds good, and that's the absolute theory. The problem becomes the longer the shutter is open, the more susceptible the image is to shake or blur. And sometimes the subject is the source of the blur. You know, try telling your child to sit still long enough for a 30-second exposure on a camera. It's never going to come out. No chance you're going to get that child to sit still for 30 seconds. And there's really no reason you would need to. Sometimes, though, the source of the camera motion is us. It's cold. It's rainy. We want to get back to the station. Sometimes we're just adrenalined up. And so when we get to the point in time where we have to use extended shutters or manual shutters, we have to go to that tried and true tool that hopefully everyone has in their tool, in their camera bag or in the investigation vehicle. And that is a tripod. You know, back in the day when Uncle Bill had the only camera in the family and he took all the pictures, it wasn't difficult to find him toting a tripod, because in the early film cameras, we had to use extended shutter times to capture images. And so a tripod was a necessity. Just because we went digital doesn't change the fact that we are going to need a tripod to stabilize the camera and capture dark and dimly lit inanimate fire scenes. It's an absolute reality. And once you understand how to use it and begin using it, you're going to start to realize, wait a minute, I don't necessarily need, you know, a portable sun on a trailer to shine out here. I can take a decent, if not even good, photograph by using this extension of the shutter time into not 1/1000th of a second, but instead 15, 20, or 30 seconds of shutter time. And it begins to change the whole technique and the approach to either nighttime exterior, or poorly lit inside fire scenes. It's a nice example. You know, yes, it's a drone shot, but it illustrates the point. You know, if we're able to stabilize the camera, either by tripod or a quality drone on a calm night, that is, I believe that picture was taken at 12-second shutter time, which means the shutter of the camera stayed open for 12 seconds compared to normally 1/1000th or 1/500th of a second. And in the process, the amount of light that was present, albeit a very limited amount. In fact, this is essentially ambient lighting by, you know, various sources, creates an image that is mildly perhaps artistic, but still depicts the outside environment, to the point where if you look hard enough and you start to study the different details, you know, there's a TV on in the living room in the center of the house. The pool at the bottom center of the screen, that little red glow, that's the LED indicator on the pool motor. Every little bit of light reaching that sensor helps write the data. And so vehicles in poorly lit areas, maybe out in the woods, we start to have opportunities to document them that otherwise we would have thought of as, we're never going to get enough light out here. This is another example. This was a this is a fire assignment I got. It's one of the few times when on the private side, I got a fire assignment at the end of the day. I was driving home from another fire and they said, we have this fire. They're telling us the house is a total loss. The city wants to knock it down tonight. You know, we got to get eyes on it real quick. And so I'm thinking, okay, I'll drive over there. I didn't think the house had to be knocked down tonight, but whatever. But the thing I was thinking about driving there was when I left the house this morning and I brought my different camera toys, I didn't bring the flash bag because I was going to a vehicle fire in a junkyard during broad daylight. And I'm like, I don't even need the bag with all the flashes and batteries in it because I'll be home by 3 p.m. And lo and behold, this is what happens. And so now I roll into this fire scene at 5:30 in the evening. And the only flash I have is the flash on the camera, which is clearly not going to document the outside of the building. But the one thing I do have is the tripod. And so I'm able to position the camera, set it on the tripod, go to a manual shutter. And I believe most of these were taken with 20-ish second shutter times. And so while the sky is essentially washed out because so much light reached the camera for so long, doesn't matter. I'm not taking a picture of the sky. I'm trying to capture the detail, in this case, some pretty interesting pattern activity on the exterior of this structure without having essentially any artificial light to add. And so not the best picture I've ever taken, but it's certainly not the worst. And given that the lighting conditions were working against me, you start to appreciate the fact that, yeah, I don't need 10 portable flashes and, you know, all these batteries to take outdoor photos in the evening or at night. Maybe a $30 quality tripod is the initial investment in this process. And it's worth considering for sure. Using the tripod in either manual or extended shutter, you often end up with these overexposed images. You know, like in the prior photo here, the setting sun really blanks out the sky detail. And if I brought this to class, you know, the photography teacher would have said, bad, overexposed. But I'm not taking pictures of the sky. I'm taking pictures of this scientific subject. And so if that's your goal, overexposing the image does yield a workable result. And there's a technique known as bracketing, in which you take a picture and you essentially dial the camera up and down, changing the settings slightly to see which photograph will yield the best result. And so don't lock yourself into one picture, one subject, either I got it or I didn't. Don't be afraid to change settings. Don't be afraid to change conditions. Add more lighting, take lighting away, extend shutter time, all for the hope of capturing at least one good image later on when you look at them. This is another example for the overexposure argument. Vehicle fires, it's a common problem. You know, in daylight outside vehicle fires, there's going to be some parts of the vehicle which are well illuminated naturally, and there's going to be other parts of the vehicle which are just not illuminated. They're heavily shadowed. In this case, it's the underside of the vehicle. And the difference between the left and the right photo is not, you know, photoshopping it or any kind of post-image enhancement work. That image on the right came directly out of the camera, but I changed the camera settings by extending the shutter time, and it creates the impression, certainly, that there was a lot more light than there really was. And I was essentially able to erase the shadow without introducing artificial lighting. And so why this type of technique has value and merit is because if I take the image on the left and I realize, I got to brighten it up so that I can show the detail on the underside. Well, if I go into the Photoshop program and start playing with settings, there could be questions raised later. Doesn't mean the photo is out, just means that there's questions that have to be answered because the photo was enhanced post-production. The photo on the right came out of the camera. Nothing was done to it other than camera settings. And as a result, there's very little argument that could be made that the photo on the right is somehow not authentic or should not be relied upon. And so that's a consideration also, is that you can get the result you want by using the camera and thereby eliminating any future debate over having used post-production software to enhance the picture. Pretty common scenario, again, when you're trying to capture patterns on the inside of the building where lighting is not the greatest. And so time being on your side, because we know the subject isn't moving, setting up a tripod, manually exposing the camera for longer than what the camera thinks is correct, ends up yielding the technical photo, which absolutely captures what you want it to make. The picture almost speaks for itself when it comes to where we believe the fire originated, where the appliance was positioned, was it actually under the hood? You know, all those things are more or less self-evident, even though that's not the picture the camera was ever going to give me. I had to tell the camera, forget what you know, here's what I want. And that was by controlling settings. And the same, you know, same image again, or same subject again, just brought the camera down low so that we're looking straight on at the wall. So there's no distortion really. And, you know, that's a good photograph. You know, there's a lot of compelling self-evident information in that photo. Then it will certainly back up the findings in your report. And that is really the end result of what you're trying to accomplish here. The setting known as aperture or f-stop, this is the amount of light which reaches the camera's image sensor while the shutter is open. Okay, so while all three of these settings are different, you start to see that there's a very interwoven relationship between them. Aperture setting, or what we know or heard of as f-stop, that's the numeric representation of the whole lens opening to a fraction. And I'm going to try to keep it as basic as I can, but if you can understand or remember just one part, and that is that the lower the F number, whether it's an F1, F2, F2.8, they vary based on the camera and the lenses. The lower the number gives you the larger opening, low, large. And therefore, when you look at the specifications for your camera, whether it's a camera or a phone, for the most part, point and shoot cameras and the cameras on our phones and tablets, you'll find out that they have very low f-stops, meaning they therefore have very large openings, apertures to the sensor, because that lets the most amount of light in. We know that our cell phone doesn't have that great of a flash on it. And therefore, since they can't give us light, we have to let in as much as possible. Most consumer drones, basic, you know, I don't want to say entry level, but, you know, economically priced drones, fixed aperture lenses, they're all 2 to 2.5, 2.8, because we're letting in the most light we can, since we know that that's an inherent limitation to any camera without a flash. And then each step that you go past that, as the number increases, so we go from, say, f2.8 to an f4, that step setting in the lens or in the camera, each step cuts the amount of light by half. So it very quickly throttles back the amount of light reaching the camera. So by and large, most point and shoot cameras and most cameras that have very small, most of the time not effective built-in flashes, they are all working with fixed f-stop lenses, generally in the 2 to 3 f2 or f3 range, because they need to be wide open to let in as much light as possible. Okay. And as a result, when you start to increase that f-stop number, which is closing down or throttling down the aperture by half each time, you need to then correspondingly increase the shutter time. Otherwise, you just realize that every photo is coming out dark and it doesn't, wait a minute, I'm taking a picture here and I just went from F2 to F4 and it's suddenly dark. Well, because I need to then slow down the shutter to let light in, even because the light is entering through a smaller opening. Those factors, and most importantly, the f-stop, the aperture setting, relative to the focal length of the lens, create the appearance or the lack of depth in a photo. And so that creates this depth of field concept in photography. And whether or not we can communicate to the audience the relative distance between background, subject, and foreground. And in some cases, we want to show that distance, and therefore the audience gets the feeling of, a picture covering a long area. Other times, it essentially flattens the image. And so these low f-stop, wide aperture cameras, fixed aperture cameras, like cell phones and tablets and entry-level drones, point-and-shoot cameras, the images are flat because the background, the subject, and the foreground are all in focus, and you don't often get to appreciate the distance or depth in the actual image. And that can sometimes be problematic in a technical field. All right, it doesn't really matter when it's your kids at the lake playing on the beach, but when we're talking about trying to represent accurately the context and the subject of a photo, showing the relative distance between foreground, background, and the subject in between can be of detriment or consequence to us. So to help you kind of understand that just a little bit better, because until you start playing with it, you're not going to appreciate what it does. When you look at the picture of the ruler and think of that as I'm trying to take a picture of this ruler. Well, at a very low F number, F2, F3, with the wide open aperture, the number 1 as well as the number 6 on the ruler will both be in focus, and so will everything in between. And therefore, it gives you the impression that they're very close together. When I go to a very high F number, like an F22 or an F24, and I take that same picture, now the distance between the camera and the start of the subject relative to the background, I start to lose the focus beyond a certain point. And that photo inherently communicates depth or distance, because the farther away things are from the camera, the less in focus they appear. And so just like you can use it to capture and express distance, you also have to be aware, though, that the subject is now coming out of focus. And generally, we don't want to create things not in focus, because the argument is always made that when you look at that ruler right now, if you glance away and look at the screen, at the picture of the ruler, where does your eye always go? Your eye will always go to the 1 and the 2, the centimeter 1 and 2 and 3, and the 32nd of an inch and the 1, because they are in sharp, clear focus. And then your eye only goes towards the background, into the blur, when you force it to go there. And so very subtly, if I misapply depth of field, I can focus on something like a knife, a gun, a bullet, a gas can, a cigarette. I can focus on those items in a way that your mind will essentially exclude everything else around them. And while that may be useful for trying to convey or compel you to believe that a weapon or an incendiary device was in the scene, its prime target for exclusion, because it's mischaracterizing. Everything in the scene is important, not just the gun, the knife, the fuse, whatever it may be. So there's working limits, and then there's kind of out of bounds limits. And you have to be careful when you get to those extremes, because you begin to potentially shape the impression of the viewer, even though we're going to presume it was not intentional. I wasn't trying to force you to look at that object. I just wanted you to know it was there. This is a good example of it. This is a gentleman, Michael Paul Smith. He's since passed away, but he's renowned for his work creating images such as this one. And so he sent me this one because I wrote to him and I said, look, I do this program and all your pictures are great, but if it had a fire truck or a police car in it, it would really send a message. And so this is what he sent me. And so you can study this picture for more or less as long as you want. You can even pause the program if you'd like. But what I want you to figure out and what I want you to try to reason is whether or not that image is real. Is that picture in real life, in real time, or does this picture represent some kind of image manipulation which has the potential to mislead or misrepresent? And so pause it, take a look at it, spend as much time on it as you want. And then when you're ready, now I'm going to go to the next slide and I'm going to kind of give you the mic drop here and you're going to realize, oh, so there it is. The picture is absolutely 100% real. This gentleman, Michael Paul Smith, he made his name in photography by building models, whether they were vehicles or dioramas and such, and then bringing those models out into the real world and staging them. In this case, he staged the engine, the Chief sedan, and the other car on a folding table in front of an actual firehouse. That's a real live firehouse next to a real live school. And then once he positioned them, he then maneuvered himself and his camera to capture this image. And feel free to look at it as long as you want and try to find the gap or the seam or the detail that gives it away. And when you can't, you'll figure out why he's so well renowned. These images, and on the next slide, there's some information if you'd like to read more about him and see his work. But the beauty of what he did is that he just showed you how depth of field can misrepresent reality. He used it for artistic purposes. We need to be aware of it simply because of the ability to mislead. And the real gem of it, beyond his skill, is that he used a 6 megapixel compact digital camera. At the time, this was roughly an $80 point and shoot camera. And he created images like this and so many others on his different websites here. Unfortunately, he's since passed, but absolutely amazing skill. And with these two photos, he may very well teach fire investigators the concept and the potential to misrepresent that depth of field can create for us. So there's that. Perhaps in a more practical sense, this was not staged for any reason other than we're conducting a training burn in one of the burn cells. In fact, the blue lighter might be somewhere in that couch right now. And the camera on the tripod is also my camera. And I'm holding another camera, and it unintentionally captured the idea of depth of field in that it blurred the foreground while focusing on the subject and the background. And you kind of realize that, yeah, even though it's a flame, my eye is still pulled to the object in sharp focus. And it isn't until I intentionally look that I realize, oh yeah, there's another camera in the foreground of the image. And then when you look at that from the long view, you realize, boy, there was a substantial amount of distance between the camera on the tripod and the burn cell. The camera was moved between this picture and this picture. It was moved horizontally just to get out of the smoke plume. But the distance between the camera and the doorway of the burn cell in both pictures is the same. One of them creates the impression of it being a lot closer than what it actually was. And so if you're photographing objects, whether they be fuel cans or victims relative to a doorway, things like that, We have to be very, very careful that what we're capturing will accurately tell the story. Another good example, I know it's not a fire, but to practice photography, go to a zoo. Because if you can learn to control the camera on animals in a zoo, they don't cooperate at all. So you quickly learn to get good simply because the subjects are moving. And so in this case, I used a high level f-stop, a high number f-stop with manually focusing on the subject, the animal. And if you look hard, you realize, yeah, there's a chain link fence in the photo. It's not perfectly crisp and clear, but it's evident that there's a chain link fence. What you don't see is the second fence. I'm shooting through a vertical fence, through the chain link fence to get the animal. There's two fences between the animal and the camera, and I made one of them disappear simply by working the focal point of the camera and the depth of the f-stop to create depth of field in the lens. More practical example for you, perhaps. This is obviously a fire in a building, and the purpose of this photo here is really not so much the patterns. You know, the pattern on the floor and the damage burning through the floor is all very interesting, but a firefighter went through the floor and was seriously injured. And this photo and several others were strictly meant to basically tell the story of falling through the floor and the distance to the floor below. And so it took a fair amount of time and many different photos, many different shots to finally get an image that I felt accurately portrayed the fact that he went through the floor and then went an appreciable distance before hitting the contents in this basement. And the challenge of it was, in a autofocus point and shoot camera, you will essentially have to pick. Does the camera focus on the burn around the floor at the floor level, or does it focus on the contents down in the basement? And as a result, one of the two, either the foreground or the background, will always be out of focus. And so I need to show distance while also keeping both in focus so that the picture speaks to whoever looks at this, because he's seriously injured. There's going to be litigation, no doubt. Workman's comp and other elements come into play, but it's not always about origin and cause, particularly when it comes to responder issues, responder injuries. And so capturing it well goes a long way to telling that story. And I think that particular image, compared to any others in the entire sequence, really communicates distance as well as the detail of what he landed in and what he managed to fall through. Excuse me. So kind of to summarize this whole depth of field discussion, you have to work with what you have, okay? If the camera that they give you is a fixed f-stop focal camera, and your control over it is substantially limited, then okay, fine. We'll have to work around that, which means we will have to more than likely take multiple shots to portray things like distance. So in the prior picture, it might be 3 or 4 photos. This is the floor, this is the hole, this is the background or the basement. And so one photo doesn't do it. You might have to do it with 3 and 4 photos to tell the different parts of the story. If you have a higher end camera that you can manually control settings, you have to become comfortable with them and never lock yourself into one specific set of rules. However, generally speaking, F8 using an ISO based on the lighting conditions is the best place to start. Okay, and then once you've framed the image, now you would use the bracketing to dial the F8 down, as well as dialing it up to finally capturing the image you want. And if you have a camera setting, you go look at your camera or go look in the instruction book. If you find a camera setting known as aperture priority, sometimes displayed as the capital A on the dial. That setting allows you to manually lock in an f-stop, but the camera automatically solves for shutter and ISO, which means you're telling the camera, this is the f-stop I want to use to capture and balance depth of field. F8 generally is a good balance point, but I want you to solve for the lighting conditions and the length of time the shutter has to be open. And so that's what either aperture priority mode does. There's something else called shutter priority, but that's really not going to work too well in most forensic applications. Shutter priority allows you to tell the camera when you want to capture motion, where intentional blur is an advantage. In most cases, that's not going to be good for a fire scene. So the bracketing concept then, once you've started with a setting, we'll say the F8, let the camera solve, take the image, dial the F above, like to an F11, and then dial it down to an F8. So you're getting larger or wider aperture setting with tighter or narrower settings. And the camera solving in between, you should get a approximately equivalent photo. In other words, the photo will be equally bright in all three of those examples. However, the distance or the depth of field that is perceived in the image is what will vary. And depending upon what you're trying to communicate, that's your point. That's your focus. That's your intent. Your focus is something else. So I led into aperture priority and shutter priority already. That just explains what they are. If you manually start to play with your camera, I would suggest starting at aperture priority, because generally we're not interested in capturing motion as much as we are with reflecting depth or space. If you add an object, I call them props generally, but like a ruler or a scale to provide some comparison to size of an object, that's legitimate. It's allowed. There's a couple of important rules, though, that you have to consider. The first is this scale loses accuracy as soon as the camera lens moves from being perpendicular above and parallel with the surface of the object. So I'm going to show you a slide in a moment that breaks that comparison out. But just understand that putting a ruler in an image to show size of an object in itself is not good enough. The second thing is that whatever image you take with the ruler, the arrow, the marker, whatever prop you're using, you need an equivalent photograph without the prop, ruler, or marker. All right. They may someday argue that the ruler causes a problem and they exclude the photo. No problem. You can exclude that photo. I've got one either right before it or right after it. It's the exact same thing. So I still have the object admissible. Just the ruler comes out. And I can always say I measured the object, and it's 1.25 inches, or it's a, 40 caliber shell, whatever it may be. So those are essentially the two absolute hard and fast rules: equivalent photo with and without the proper marker. And if you're putting an object in for scaling, you have to maintain your lens position. So the photo on the left, this is a 1/2 inch gas pipe fitting out of a gas explosion on a water heater. Pretty straight up call. So the photo on the left reflects overall that the size of that opening, I'll call it, it's roughly about an inch and 1/8, even though it's 1/2 inch pipe outside diameter, it's about 1 1/8 inches. The photo on the right is the exact same thing. I moved nothing. I touched nothing. All I did was back up about 4 steps so that now the camera is pointing at the ruler and at the pipe at an angle. And suddenly something doesn't match the story. Something doesn't match your report, because according to the ruler, that pipe fitting now is running upwards of 1.75 inches outside dimension. And so that's just a perfectly clear example of how, when you're using an object for scaling, like a ruler, you have to ensure that the camera and the lens is perpendicular above and parallel with the surface of the object below. Any deviation from that, and you start to immediately skew the scale that you're trying to use to show the size or dimension, okay? If you're working with small details, particularly with a automatic and like a point and shoot camera, where you have no ability to tell the camera, this is what I want you to focus on, and you're trying to take a picture. In this case, on the top left, we see the electrical conductors kind of hanging there between the two studs. There's a little activity on the end of the wires. We want a photo to show that. Well, since there's no background near those wires, the camera sees past them and judges the focal point to be somewhere in between the wall and the garage door. And as a result, you'll almost never get a quality focused picture of just those wires. And so the easiest way to solve that problem is to create a backdrop, give the camera something to see, because the way the camera autofocus works is that it measures light reflected off the camera in judging the distance for setting the lens. So if I give it a surface, in this case, a piece of blue construction paper, I create a very nice backdrop with clear color contrast. So there's no question that what I'm looking at is just the wires. And even a point and shoot camera can now easily focus and take a decent photograph. If you're working with a camera that you can manually focus, you can still do it because it certainly makes the wires more distinctly visible and the photo is more self-evident, but it's not as critical because you manually can focus in on whatever you want. A similar kind of thing when you're trying to express a point, in this case, that the window glass was in the up position on the doorway, on the car door. You know, I've seen plenty of times where people take their notepad and they just put it in the background. That's fine. Just realize that when the camera's backdrop is white, like white paper, the high level of reflectance coming off the white paper leads the camera to believe that the scene is brighter than it actually is. And as a result, the camera will throttle its settings to expose an image based on what it thinks is plenty of light. And in reality, I'm trying to take a picture of sooted up glass on melted paint with melted rubber gasketing. There's almost no light reflection there. And so by using a subtle color, like a medium blue, or in this case, I'm using a yellow, you're not misrepresenting to the camera how much light there is, and therefore the camera won't intentionally throttle back and give you this seemingly dark or dimly lit image. It's kind of, yeah, you're fooling the camera. Another thing, I don't know if this is a photographic technique or a tool technique, but I paint the blade of my shovel. And I painted a color that clearly doesn't exist in a fire scene. Because if I want to shovel debris and I'm shoveling debris and I pry up a wire or something out of the debris before I even start to break it apart and discard the waste, I want to take a picture and show you I just pried a wire or a casing out of the debris. If the shovel is black or unpainted and dirty and rusted, all of that is going to blend in very nicely with all the fire debris. And what I want you to do is I want you to see the wire or the shell casing or something. And I don't want you to spend too much time looking at my shovel and getting distracted. So I actually play the mind trick a little bit and you tell them the shovel is green. Don't worry about the shovel, or the shovel is orange. What I'm showing you is this wire here on the right. See how it is coming out of the debris, and suddenly you're able to guide the mind of the audience you're not misrepresenting anything. You're just helping them not get distracted by what's happening. So, I mean, the truck company is never going to let you paint the shovels orange, but in the investigative truck, there might be a reason to consider painting them a obviously non-fire scene color. And it's very easy to clean. Rinse it off and spray another coat on and you're done. Same thing, documenting points of entry. You know, I can write one sentence in a report that says, you know, building was secured at the time or building wasn't secure at the time of the fire. But a couple of well-placed photos can really tell that story. And so photo on the left, lockjam, no evident damage. The damage on the inside is because people have closed the door with the deadbolt extended, probably over the course of time. Photo on the right really makes a compelling argument that the deadbolt was not engaged because there's going to be a protected pattern under that thumb turn when I flip it and expose protected brass or shiny metal. But the real interesting one is the picture frame in the window. So there was a stained glass or a frosted glass panel in the center of that door. And of course, you know, it's a fire scene and maybe somebody broke it, reached in and unlocked the lock, flipped the lever, let themselves in. And on the way out, they didn't bother to lock the deadbolt. So that's how it went down. Yep, maybe. Or thankfully, all the fire debris landed on the floor, created a protective layer so that no matter how many firefighters went traipsing through the front door, we have an intact, unbroken, entire piece of that stained glass window. And now I can pretty conclusively say it wasn't broken before the fire. And so that story gets easier to tell when you can, you know, provide these photos to tell that story. A couple more photos with some hose work to rinse the glass off just as it lays there on the floor. And you answer any question or doubt about the glass relative to possibly a breaking and entering. Some general words about adding lighting. We know that we probably are going to have to do it. And we talked about color temperature. My caution is when you add floodlights or scene lights, try to keep them all of the same general temperature. It's not really a good idea to take a warm, soft, yellowy floodlight like an old Circle D and mix it with a modern, bright white LED light in the same scene. The camera is not going to decode the white balance very easily, and you're just going to kind of, you know, give it more things to get confused about. So whichever light you work with, if you work with Circle D floodlights, that's great, that's fine. You know, just be consistent, at least in any given photo shoot. You can change light from room to room, but within a given room and any given photo, try to match your artificial light to all roughly the same color temperature. And remember that point, if they ever challenge you or question you about, well, you know, you added 4 floodlights into this living room to take this picture. Yeah, I added white or visible light because that helps me and that helps the camera see what's already there. That's all it does. Whether the room is dark or the room is bright, everything is still there. It's just helping the camera or helping the investigator see it. And just be aware that those rules do change a little bit when you start talking about alternative light sources like ultraviolet and infrared. That's a whole different animal. We're strictly talking right now about white light, artificial lighting. Capturing the scene in a systematic manner. I think we all kind of understand the concept. The important thing I try to take away and I try to do on every assignment is always proceed the same way. You know, start with the title shot, move through. I happen to like moving clockwise through the fire scene, whatever it is, always the same way every time. And you're building the story even before that first photograph that may even be within the area of origin. And so kind of think of this, you know, as orbits. You're orbiting the fire scene and you're starting on the periphery. I like to capture, if possible, the entire property in question, not just the building, not just the parking lot, but to the edge of the property or to the curb line of the street. That's that first outer orbit I try to get to any extent possible. And then, you know, now that I know the property in question, now I'll move it to the building in question. And then once I'm in the building in question, I'll move to the store or the room of origin or the room of interest. And you slowly orbit your way inward. And then whatever happens is part of your investigation. The ending of your photo series is essentially the same process in reverse. When you're all said and done, and you're like, all right, we're ready to wrap this up, let's go. You orbit in reverse. You start with these general, as I left them fire scene photos, working backwards to the final large orbit, and then ultimately ending on your ending shot. You're in your title slide, but now as your ending shot. And so there's a start, there's a definitive start, there's a definitive finish, and everything in between is the story that someday I'm going to tell either in a report or possibly in testimony. Because if this is your first photo of your fire scene, you know, let's say it was a car fire. If your first photo is this, how much information are we conveying to our audience? Yeah, I get it. The car's burnt up, you know, move on. But the truth is, if you start further back and you begin your same systematic approach, this photo tells more of the story. I got it. There's a fully burned car sitting over there. But what isn't sitting over there is any debris on the ground reminiscent of a car fire. We've all seen car fires. We've all been to car fires that are burned to the rim like this car is. And there's debris all over the ground, melted, different things, spilled, pooled. Yeah, except for this car. This car is burned to a crisp inside and out, and there's no debris on the ground. That is a bigger part of the story than this picture would ever convey. All right. So as close as I can get you to a checklist of what photos do I take at a fire scene? Well, you take them all and you take as many as you need, but generally speaking, this would be a great place to start. All right. And I'm not going to go through the whole list. It's just there for you to kind of make sure we are capturing everything. And in fact, if you look at that list, you realize that you're more than halfway through that list before you even get to the presumed room of origin. And so if your first photo is the object or area of origin, you've already missed a fair amount. And that's the reason why, you know, this systematic approach is so critical. Similar kind of thing with a vehicle fire. You know, the context of the fire is not just the burn damage, particularly with the vehicle. It's where it was and how it came to rest there, whether it was in motion and caught fire and they pulled over, or if it was parked and spontaneously seemed to catch fire. The context, more so than ever, is the surrounding area, because in so many times car fire patterns are exceptionally difficult to infer. And if you don't have the context of any surrounding surfaces like buildings or pavement, you know, adjacent garbage cans, anything else that reflected the damage and impact of the fire, helps you to piece it together. Just give you a couple of little pieces here on aerial photography, just because, you know, if you have the ability to either drone it or get up on an aerial device, it goes a long way to the storytelling. I don't know that you're ever going to prove origin just off a drone photo, but it still has a point and a purpose. And so this is a good example I used. It's an RV fire, and no matter how many times you walked around these remains, you're looking at the fire scene from roughly 5'6" off the ground. I call it the human tripod. When every photo in a case file looks like this, we're missing stuff, because the world is more than 5'6" off the ground. And we have to either move ourselves or move the camera to backfill that. And so that's the picture of this burned out frame of an RV. And now, from only 30 or so feet in the air, you know, I start to get more information. There's more information in the second photo than there was in the first. Doesn't necessarily prove origin, but it starts to build the story. And if you can position yourself in such a way that you can see the entire surface, and in this case, really the only surface, and that is the ground, you know, that's it. There's no real surrounding walls of a room to look for patterns, but there's clearly patterning fire influence patterns on the ground. And until you get yourself in a position that either you can see them or they can be captured and brought to you, you're leaving story time on the table. And the idea is we want to pick up as much of that data as possible. So as I mentioned, drones are not likely to prove a specific down to the moment of ignition cause, but they can really get you through the origin where multiple buildings may be up for discussion. If nothing else, it just brings context to a story, whether it's a fire in the middle of nowhere or a fire that leads to multiple building, losses. I don't know that you need a drone for a car fire, but it raises the point that simply getting the camera above the surface improves the information available. So this is the typical car fire, right? We burn a car, and a half dozen investigators stand around looking at it roughly 5'6" off the ground. And this is what everyone sees and starts to scratch their head. If I can get you 8 foot in the air on a step ladder, or if the engine is still there and they parked close enough, can I get on top of the hose bed and look down at the vehicle? Because you start to see a little bit more in this picture than you do in the prior picture. And then if I'm somehow able to get myself directly above and look at the fire scene from this dimension, there's a lot more information than the first picture. And I get closer to figuring out things that happen. It doesn't have to be a drone. It can be, 8 or 10 foot top of the rescue box. Pull the rescue up alongside. Let me climb on the roof of the rescue and point the camera down and see what I got. If it really matters because maybe somebody died in that vehicle, Chief, bring the aerial ladder over here because I need to extend it straight across the top of the car so I can look straight down between 2 rungs and photograph the patterning, the visual indications of what happened. You have the tools, sometimes you just have to get them out of the toolbox. Similar thing, this obviously was a very well-involved house. There was one fatality, and I worked this on the private side, but I thought to myself when I took this picture, I don't believe anybody has seen the house from this perspective yet, because the nearest street access is off the top of the picture, some 15 or 20 more feet away. And from every fire scene photo I saw and video, I didn't see the aerial ladder ever deployed. This is a 1-story, ranch style house. They didn't need the aerial for this. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm the first person to see it from this perspective. And does this help me better understand anything about it? And now that I shift the drone a little bit, can I tell more of the story? Can I support more of my findings? And off on the bottom or middle right here, you see those numbers and arrows on the ground there. It's just something we're experimenting with, kind of like yellow evidence markers at a crime scene or a fire scene. What if we scale those up for drone photographs? And so we have large pre-printed corrugated plastic letters and numbers for north reference. And in this case, I'm like, well, we can pretty easily convey that, building 1 B side spread to building 2 D side, and, just playing around with it. But keep that in mind. There's some tools you can use and techniques that we've used for a long time at ground level with 35 millimeter cameras that we can now translate upwards for use with drones and elevated photography. Because someday you're gonna have a fire like this, pretty well involved 1-story building. And no matter how many times you walk around it, left to right or right to left, this is all you get to see. But if I can take you 150, 200 feet in the air and show you the entire fire scene and let you look at it long enough, the same way that you would look at any other aspect of your scene while standing on the ground, kneeling on the ground, whatever, do you get more information? Does this better tell the story of what happened? Can I express to people the magnitude of the fire between this picture and the prior picture? Because that's the picture everyone remembers seeing, is the street level photo. that's the magnitude photo. And if you really want to send a message, well, there's the aerial photo from the internet before, and there's the same photo after the fire. Now, do we at least convey the story of magnitude? You know, I'll get you deep inside to the area of origin, you know, several hundred photos later. But for right now, when I tell you that this fire, as the result of X, Y, and Z, you know, destroyed so many businesses, yeah, you're capturing magnitude pretty well. All right, some general takeaways here. It's all about telling the story. I encourage you to have the same introduction as well as the same exit. And so you kind of create the story and you have a definitive start and a definitive end. And so whoever is looking at it is not left hanging at the end going, did he finish the investigation, or is this how far they got and they gave up because there's no more photos after this point? And if that's the case, how come the report has a conclusion on it? So we're trying to keep it all together and eliminate those future doubts and questions. All right. That's the end of the presentation. There's my contact information there. You'll have the Dropbox. And I look forward to the future Q&A session, which we'll set up, and I'm sure Bill will let you know.
Yeah, so, Dave, thank you so much. It was another incredible presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. I recognize some of those photographs. You're actually published from the April 2018 Fire and Arson Investigator magazine. You're on the UAVs, and then the persistence of ignitable liquids and unburned substrates was done by Jesse Lampf. And he did our number 8 session that we have with DCARI. So again, Dave, we'll bring you back for a Q&A, and I would encourage everyone to take the test, and you'll receive tested hours for attending the training. So thanks again. We really appreciate it.